I do now.
You do now. Thank you, everyone, for joining this informational hearing on the drought situation. And, it is imperative that we keep contact with you, the public. And I suggested to Cindy earlier that perhaps we have some type of a request to get everybody's email address so that we could email you directly when we're having one of these meetings and not rely on the reclamation districts to do so. But we could talk about that later. But at any rate, thank you all for attending, and I'll hand it over to Melinda to navigate through the process.
Well, real quick, if you guys, what I'll put is in the chat function, I'll put my email address, which is cindy@northdeltawater.net. And if anybody wants to be added to an email list for agendas for either drought updates or regular board meetings, go ahead and email me, and then I'll get you on that list. So
That's a good way to do it.
Yeah.
Thank you. And, I don't know what's going to happen the rest of the year, but I could imagine that we may have one or two more of these. We'll see. So go ahead, Melinda. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I'm Melinda Terry, the manager for North Delta Water Agency, and appreciate everybody joining us. I won't do most of the talking today. It'll be Ann Williams, our engineer, doing most of it. But we did want to take an opportunity at this point to at least provide an update on what we know about some of the hydrologic conditions that we're experiencing, the actual water quality within our agency's boundaries, and the actions that the water board is taking, such as curtailments and some of their emergency regulations, or the temporary urgency change petitions rather that they have approved. And then really also then talk about the contract itself and what's in the contract that deals with drought. We want to make sure to remind everybody what protections are in place. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Ann Williams to begin.
Thanks, Melinda. Cindy, I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen.
Yeah, you should be able to.
Did that work?
Yep.
Are you seeing the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Now you saw the slide change, right?
I wasn't paying attention. I don't see a slide.
And it looks like you have the PDF file up rather than the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. Other screen here. Okay, is that better, Gary?
No, I'm not sure what just happened, but hold on. Oh, yeah, it looks like it is going to scroll through, Ann.
Yeah, that's
Is that all good?
I think so. Go forward so we can, yeah.
Good? Okay. So like Melinda mentioned, and Melinda, you, Kevin, Gary, feel free to jump in if I miss something or you have additions. So I'll cover most of these topics, and then Melinda, I've got, the couple of last ones towards the end of the agenda are for you to cover, but go ahead and jump in anytime. And Cindy, if you could monitor the chat and just make sure we don't see any hands go up or have questions, keep me posted if we need to pause on any of these topics. So first of all, we'll give a quick update on hydrologic conditions, water quality conditions within North Delta, other Delta operations. Melinda mentioned the state and federal projects temporary urgency change petition for their Delta standards that they must meet under their water rights, as well as water right curtailments by the state board, and then some of the North Delta contract provisions and protections that the contract provides for water users within North Delta. And then I know we're all very focused on this year and right now, but we also do want to talk about some future drought planning for next year in case things remain dry. So I like starting with this graphic. It's the Northern Sierra Precip 8-station index. You can see a map there on the top left of the locations where this is measured. And this year is the dark blue line that runs through the middle of the graphic. And you can see that currently we're at a water year precip of 39.8. Really early in the year, back towards Halloween, we saw a significant increase in precip. We had a couple really big storms. And then we had a plateau month where we really didn't see much rain at all in November. We had another nice storm event come through around Christmas and saw a large increase in the index. And then really from January until these last April storms we had, we really didn't see a lot of rain. And it really, our systems got pretty dry. Little bump up here in April, and then now in what we're looking at over the next couple months, I don't see any big storms coming through in the forecast, and we may be close to where we end up for the year. As you can see, it's quite a bit below average, which is this light blue shaded area, although quite a bit better than last year. So in terms of storage, this graphic is showing the major reservoirs, and we really focus a lot in here on Oroville, since that's what North Delta's contract is really focused on, a state water project. And you can see that they're at 55% of capacity right now, or almost 75% of where they would be on the state as kind of a historical average. Unfortunately, Shasta, which is our largest reservoir in Northern California, is quite a bit less. It's at only 40% of capacity and less than 50% of its historical average. Things at Folsom, our other large reservoir here in Northern California, do look really well. So they're at 88% of capacity. That difference is mainly due to their flood control curve. And they're at about 110% of average. So things at Folsom are looking particularly well this year. So just to look in a little bit closer on each reservoir. So starting with Shasta, you can see the current year here again in this dark blue line. And unfortunately, what you're seeing is that storage in Shasta this year is less than it has been in most of our other kind of recent drought years. So you see 2013 to 14 here in the red line, 14 and 15 in the lighter blue line, 15 and 16 in the green line, and last year, 2020 and 21 in the yellow line. So we're at only 1.8 million acre feet in Shasta, which is really low and going to cause a lot of challenges and shortages along the Sacramento River system. I mentioned it, and it's a little bit odd, but Oroville is actually higher in storage right now. So there's more water in Oroville, even though it's a smaller reservoir than Shasta. That's sitting around 1.9 million acre feet. We are starting to see the inflows recede a little bit and outflows from the reservoir increasing. And so Lake Oroville is right at that plateau point where we'll be switching from gaining in storage to decreasing in storage. But you can see that in terms of Oroville storage, we all remember last year we had power outages with the lake going lower in elevation than the power generation capabilities. And you can see from this graph that we're quite a bit better than we were at the same time last year. And DWR is not forecasting the same type of challenges that we saw last year at Oroville. We hit on Folsom a little bit already too, but this graph is showing you the current storage there. And you can see that we really are quite a bit better in Folsom storage than the last couple of years. And these benefits at Oroville and Folsom are really due to where the hydrology has hit this year. So a lot of those rain and snow events that we've seen have been more in the Central Sierra and have really benefited the Feather and American River watersheds and less so than the Shasta River watershed this year. So if we look at a reservoir storage comparison, looking at each of those three major reservoirs, you can see that we do have more water in storage this year than we did at the same time last year. So 4.6 million acre feet. And that's more similar to a 2014 or 2015 type level for storage. And again, I'll point out one more time that Oroville is in a much better spot than it has been in these prior years. This is a graph showing the snow water content. And so what it's showing is that we are at only 7%. I don't think this is surprising. We've seen some warmer temperatures. Our snow is melting off. And so we've seen that inflow into the reservoirs, and we'll keep seeing a little bit here as that drops off and as we move into the summer, and we'll lose the rest of our snowpack. I like this graphic. I apologize for how messy it looks. I'm actually borrowing it from a presentation that the Department of Water Resources did a couple of days ago at a state board meeting. But this is their projected end of month storages for Oroville based on the forecast that they've been running. So what I want to point out is actual, so current, that's, you know, the black line you're seeing here through this graphic. Back in February, stepping back to when they start their forecasts for the year, is the blue line here. That's the February forecast. And then moving into March is the orange forecast. And you see quite a big drop from that February forecast down to the March forecast. And that's really because we saw a really dry February and not a lot of rain events and things. And you can just see how much that forecast has changed over those months. As we move into May, that's the green dashed line, and you can see it's back up right around the same levels we were projecting, or DWR was projecting back in February, and actually ending up quite a bit better than what we were looking at early in the year. And again, a large part of this is really due to the benefit that those April storm events brought to the Feather River watershed. So looking at Delta operations a little bit, Delta inflow is around 8,600 CFS. We're currently in balanced conditions, and exports are pretty minimal right now. Projects aren't pumping a lot of water through the Delta, and that's largely through some constraints through the temporary urgency change petition that we'll talk about a little bit later. And that was approved for April through June, which will limit some of the export pumping that's going on then. Currently, the Delta cross channel gates are closed. However, they will be opening up this weekend for Memorial Day, and then are likely to continue opening on weekends and closing during the week. Although we've heard from DWR and Bureau staff that they'll be watching water quality closely as they're making those openings and closings. Okay, so maybe we'll pause there. Cindy, you don't see any questions or hands in the chat?
No, I do not.
Okay, so we'll focus in a little bit more on water quality and current conditions that we're seeing there. And I'll show through all of the graphs of the monitoring locations within North Delta that are tied to our contract and where we are with those criteria. But I will move quickly because I think for now, at least, we have some good news. So the water quality is well within the North Delta contract criteria at each of the locations right now. And so things are looking pretty good in terms of water quality. So this first graph here is Sacramento River at Rio Vista. So the blue line here again is our current, and that's our 14-day mean. That's what our contract compliance is based on. And the red line is the North Delta contract criteria. And you see that in terms of EC, we're well below the contract criteria right now, and things are trending up a little bit, but our daily averages are still well below the contract criteria.
And this is Steve. The light blue line above the red line, does that indicate the 1641 water quality standards at Edmonton?
Are you on?
He skipped ahead to the next slide.
Wait, I'm sorry, are you guys seeing the double slide?
Oh, I am seeing a double slide, excuse me. Yeah.
Oh, well, you guys should have told me that.
And I don't have
I'm
double
only
vision.
seeing one.
Yeah, because I have a
Well,
bunch of.
I'm seeing, it says next slide above it. Excuse me, sorry.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure how to switch that. So is it distracting? Is it hard to see?
It's not showing two on our screen.
It's because I have stuff, I have
Oh.
stuff over that part of the,
Is that better?
no. Oh, there you go. Yeah,
There
yeah,
you
yeah.
go.
Yeah.
Okay, Cindy, you guys should have told me
Sorry.
that.
I didn't know.
You were getting a
I
little
wasn't really paying
preview,
attention.
a
Oh,
little
shoot.
preview of the upcoming slides, I guess. So Steve, here we go. So this is 3 Mile Slough. So the dark blue line here is the 14-day mean EC at 3 Mile Slough. That's what your contract criteria, the red line on this graph is based on. We're also plotting Edmonton here. That's the green line. And currently the D1641 standard, this light blue line you pointed out, the 2.78, that's the critical year standard under D1641 at Edmonton.
So that's the TUCP number then?
So I have a whole slide. I added another one for
Oh.
us to go into more detail on this later. So this standard is at Edmonton. However, the project submitted their TUCP requesting to move the standard, so to move the 2.78 criteria from Edmonton to 3 Mile Slough.
Okay.
The state board issued their order that does approve that, but puts a condition on it. And I've got a whole slide here and a couple more agenda items, I think, that'll go through that in detail. So right now, the standard is currently being met and is still located at Edmonton.
But there's a big difference when you look at this slide. Well, first of all, you can see that the dark blue line at the bottom, our water quality is trending up.
Yep.
And the red line is our contract, which is different than the TUCP. And it is getting close to the contract criteria then.
Yes, and we'll point
Closer.
out, it is, yes. And we'll point out, we are coming off a spring tide cycle, which had relatively high ECs.
Okay.
And so when we last spoke with DWR, they do anticipate that the next tidal cycles will be lower tides and less EC than this past tide we're just coming out of.
So less exchange, basically.
Let's see, you had one more question in there.
Yeah, there's a question. It says, what is it? One of the public asked, what is a TUCP?
Okay, we can answer that briefly now, but I've got more info on it later.
And I'm just having a hard time following some of these acronyms that you guys are fluently using.
Okay. The good news is for right now, you just need to know that the light blue line up here, the 2.78, this is the water quality criteria that the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project are required to meet under the terms of their own water rights through the State Water Board's decision 1641. So this criteria is at Edmonton. However, in drought years and in other years, the projects can submit a request to modify those standards. And so that's done through a temporary urgency change petition that goes to the state board to modify those terms and conditions of their water rights. But Melinda pointed out a good note, and those standards, so the 2.78, those are based on water year type index. And so those are based on a different calculation, a different number, a different index than what the North Delta water quality contract criteria are based on. So your red lines here, those are based on the graphs at the end of your contract, but those are really based on the 4 River Basin Index. So it's a different index that the criteria are based on. Last year, when we were looking at water quality and things, you would have seen the red line and the blue line pretty close together. I believe North Delta's contract was 2.77 and the standard under decision 1641 was 2.78. But this year, it's really a nature of the difference in and how this standard is set versus how the North Delta standard is met. So your contract is providing for a better water quality than what the projects need to meet under their own water rights this year. We'll just skim quickly through these. So it'll look very similar. So the blue line is the current water quality 14-day mean under at each of these stations, and you'll see the red line. A couple of them, you'll also see a blue line. Again, that's the same line as we were just talking about in more detail on the prior slide. That's the standard that the projects are meeting under their own water rights under Decision 1641. But what you see is at this station, for example, they're much closer together than at Edmonton. We'll keep moving through here. And we'll continue to monitor these and provide our updates at the board meetings. We also do look more frequently and meet with DWR staff a couple times a month. And so we are tracking that closely. So we've got a whole, we've covered quite a bit of this already, but we've got a whole agenda item on it. So this is the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project's temporary urgency change petition. And so due to the drought conditions and the dry forecasts back at the end of March, they filed a petition to the State Water Board. And what they were asking for was to modify the terms and conditions of Decision 1641. It looks like I've got a typo there, so don't look too closely. And so what they were requesting was a change in the standards from April through June. And so their request is limited to that time frame. So they request to reduce some of the Delta outflow standards. This is similar to what we've seen last year and in prior drought years, down from what would be required of 7,100 CFS down to 4,000 CFS. I mentioned the export limitations. That's kind of another add-in that gets added to this is when the projects aren't meeting their standards under their water rights, they're limiting their exports because they're not meeting those standards. There was also a reduction on the San Joaquin River flows down to a lesser amount. The key one here, number 4, is what I've shown in bold. That's to relocate the Western Delta compliance point from Edmonton to 3 Mile Slough. And so that's the one we were just showing on the graph with the blue lines and the red lines. And that this is really the important one for North Delta Water Agency. So the State Water Board did approve this request in early April, and they put a condition on it really to prevent injury to senior water right holders like yourselves. So the relocation, the movement of that standard from Edmonton to 3 Mile Slough will only occur once the project stopped diverting or storing water.
And this is Tom. If I can point out to those on the call, that effectively moves the measuring point upstream further away from the salt source, the ocean, thereby making it easier or relaxing the quality standards. And that's the point of that whole exercise.
That's right.
That up.
Thanks, Tom. Okay. Now we're going to go back to the TUCP again. So I know you guys are all getting it straight now. So just hold on to that thought and we'll get to it once we circle back to North Delta's contract a little bit later. So at the moment, I'm going to provide an update on curtailments. Michael George and Lindsay Kammerer from the Delta Water Master's office were unable to join us today, but this is some information from the recent State Water Board meetings and Michael George's presentation to the board just 2 days ago. So currently term 91 is not in effect. This is really the first round of curtailments we would see, and it's, we typically see it in most of the drier years during the summertime. And so really what we've seen with those April storms has deferred the implementation of term 91. So this will curtail the junior water right holders to the Central Valley Project and State Water Project so that they won't be able to divert as the projects start releasing previously stored water for their own needs. We saw a notice come out from the state board that this will likely be in effect soon, probably in the next week or so. In addition, the state board is working on refinements to their water unavailability methodology or their curtailment process. So they are identifying that they're likely going to curtail licenses, all post-14 water rights in June, and potentially even some pre-1914 water rights in July. They did update their information recently, and again, it's largely due to those spring rain events we saw, but they're no longer anticipating curtailments of riparian rights within the Sac or San Joaquin systems. There won't be a material effect to water users within North Delta, and then we'll go through those protections that the contract is providing you within North Delta. But I did want to point out here that these curtailments will require water right holders to submit some paperwork. A couple of you are subject to the enhanced monthly reporting requirements. And so you will need to continue to comply with those and to submit the required reports and certifications as needed or as requested by the state board.
And those couple of us, Ann, are just the very few diverters who divert a very large amount. I want to say 10,000 acre feet per month.
That's right, Steve. I forget what their threshold is, but there are, I think, 4 of you that I'm aware of within North Delta that are having to comply with this.
And Tom Slater might know that because 999 is one of them. So.
Yeah, I
Wait.
believe 10,000, Steve.
All right, so make sure you keep getting your monthly reports in. And if you get a notice or letter from the State Water Board talking about curtailment certifications, again, that's likely to occur in June for post-14 water rights. Make sure you comply with that within I believe it's a 7-day time frame. So, okay. Well, the good news is that you are within North Delta Water Agency and you get the benefit of the North Delta Water Agency contract with DWR. And this assures a dependable supply of suitable quality water. So it protects water from that ocean salinity. We have those year-round standards at 7 locations. And this contract really supplements your water rights during curtailment periods. So even if your water rights are curtailed by the state board, you are able to continue diverting water under the North Delta contract. The contract does include a drought emergency provision, and I think that's our next topic here that we'll go into quite a bit more detail on.
Hey, before we do that, is there any questions, Cindy, pending in terms of that right to continue diverting during curtailments or?
I don't see anybody's hands raised, and I don't see any questions in the chat. Does anybody have any questions of Ann or anybody else?
Yeah, and I'll just add, to that before Ann moves on, is essentially the contract, operates kind of like a drought insurance policy. Every year, the agency on your behalf, we collect the assessments and then make payments to the Department of Water Resources. And that's for the right to divert their stored water when it's being released. And so that is the insurance policy aspect of it, if you will. In many years, you're not needing to use the North Delta water, but in these dry years and a drought year, it's a great insurance policy.
Okay.
One thing I'd like to state about that, Melinda, and I told it to the lady in Ag Alert, there were a couple of inaccuracies in the article, but I tried to relay to her that the North Delta Water Agency does not own any water, does not benefit itself from the contract. We merely administer the contract that was signed by the agency on behalf of the landowners within the North Delta Water Agency sphere. And the water rights and the water does belong to them, not the North Delta Water Agency, correct?
Yeah, I mean, they have the water rights, but it's, yeah, we signed it, but the contract itself does confer this right, for them to continue diverting. It's not a water right that it's conferring on them. It's conferring on them the right to divert during these.
The right to divert, whether there's natural riparian flow or not.
Yes, because you're basically paying for the right to divert their stored water.
But the lady that I was talking to kind of insinuated that, well, you, the North Delta Water Agency, are using this water, and why should you be able to use the water? I said, well, it is not the North Delta Water Agency's water. It is the landowners.
Yeah, we don't, we don't use it.
That pay
Yeah.
the price to the state and to administer the agency that receive the benefit of being able to divert the water.
Correct. We are not a water district. The agency does not divert or deliver any water. Correct. It's just conferring upon the water users within our boundaries the right to divert that water.
And most people on this Zoom meeting probably know that, but I want to make sure that everyone knew it.
Thank you. Okay, Ann.
Okay. So the contract does include provisions for emergencies. The one we'll focus on is the drought emergency provision. And to trigger this, all three criteria must occur. And so we'll walk through them one by one, and we'll spend the longest time, I think, on the last one, which brings back in the question of the temporary urgency change petition. And so we'll circle back on that. So the first of the criteria is that the Four River Basin Index is less than an average of 9 million acre feet in 2 years. And so you see off to the right here, I've got the index for last year, 6.4, and the index for this year, which is 10.6. And that was based on the May 1 Bulletin 120 forecast, which gives us an average of 8.5 million acre feet and triggers this criteria. The second is that there's limited deliveries or allocations to state water project contractors. And so the allocations that were last announced on March 18th had state water project allocations at 5%. So well below this 50% trigger. And the third trigger is that a state water resources control board emergency regulation is in effect to maintain water quality different than from the contract criteria. And so this is that trigger in this criteria that we were looking at on the water quality slide, where we were looking at the difference between the blue line, the criteria under decision 1641, versus the red line, the North Delta contract criteria. So the state water.
And can I jump in just one real quickly? Your prior slide shows the acronym TCO.
Oh, yes.
We've been talking about TCP, and just to be clear, the TCO is the temporary urgency change order, which was the approval of the petition by the State Water Board, just for clarity.
Thank you. I would have thought that was a typo. Thanks for the clarification.
Come on, Steve. I can't have two typos in one presentation. Just gotta have one. Okay, so this is a state board order that essentially is approving the petition, like Gary mentioned. This is the TUCO here, and it's approved for April 4th through June 30th. To move the standard from Edmonton, that 2.78 to 3 Mile Slough. But the condition that the State Water Board put on this, again, it's to protect, to have no injury to other water right holders. It says when the Central Valley Project and State Water Project are directly diverting or storing water on a net basis from sources within the Bay Delta watershed and not supplementing flows in the Delta to meet water quality or flow requirements, the compliance location remains at Emmetton. So what this means in simple terms, and this is directly quoted from the order, is that when the projects are storing water or directly diverting or exporting water through the Delta, they need to meet the standard at that downstream location at Emmetton. And so this standard isn't modified. When the projects are no longer storing water, when they're making supplemental releases to meet in-basin demands and water quality, that's when the compliance location moves. And so that would move the standard, the 2.78, the number stays the same, but it would move the standard from Emmetton to 3 Mile Slough. As we looked at earlier, North Delta's criteria at 3 Mile Slough is quite a bit lower. It was 1.42 for most of June and 2.08 for the last couple days in June there. So currently, overall on a net basis in the watershed, we are still storing water. And so it's about 2,000 CFS, and the projects are still what's considered diverting about another 1,000 CFS. And so the calculation that we're looking at for this trigger is really the supplemental project water calculation, which is essentially the same as the Term 91 criteria for implementation. And so supplemental project water is currently still negative. It's about negative 3,500 CFS. And so as we watch this supplemental project water go from negative approaching zero and then into the positive, that's when we believe this standard will switch. And so it'll trigger the movement of the standard from Emmetton to 3 Mile Slough. Again, I mentioned earlier with the Term 91, we anticipate that this shift will occur within the next week or two. So although the standard might move locations, it's not to say that DWR would change their operation or that we might see significant changes. It's just that this would trigger this third criteria of the drought emergency provision of North Delta's contract. The other piece we heard is that they are not likely to file an additional temporary urgency change petition for the latter half of the summer period. So back when we were looking at things a couple months ago and the forecasts were really dry, the projects had anticipated that they might need another petition to modify summertime standards, and that is no longer the case. They've identified that they think they've got enough water in Orville and Folsom to meet the unmodified standards for the rest of the summer.
Which means, Anne, that July through, that's for the summer, like you say, they'd be meeting at the D1641 standard at Emmetton then.
That's right.
Okay.
And the drought emergency provision would no longer be triggered.
Okay.
Right, and that I was gonna have Kevin possibly at some point weigh in on the significance of that for people that may have claims later in.
Okay, I think I'll start to get into the claims a little bit, Steve, and then I think Kevin and Melinda will jump in here. Article 4 of the contract identifies that when a drought emergency exists, a special contract claims procedure will be established by the state. And so that's what we've gone through in 2015. That was the last time that the claims procedure was established, and when the emergency drought provision was enacted. The claims procedure does require significant records and information be provided to DWR. We've been coordinating with DWR on this. So we've met with them and their staff a couple of times to identify that we see the emergency provision close to triggering and potentially triggering. So they agree with us and are now watching it closely and are even starting to develop a claims procedure in anticipation of it being triggered. Again, it'll likely be similar to 2015 for those who participated in that year.
And before we move on, I just want to tell everyone the claims process in our contract what the state will compensate for is specified. So I'm just going to go through the three things, which is the state shall compensate the user for loss of net income for each acre that either is planted to a more salt tolerant crop in the current year or is not planted to any crop in the current year, provided such determination not to plant was reasonable based on the drought emergency. And thirdly, or it had a reduced yield due to the drought emergency calculated on the basis of the user's average net income for any of the 3 prior 5 years. And so that's a lot of the paperwork, as you can see, that would be involved that Ann was talking about. But those are the 3 things that they're required to compensate for.
And to further clarify, they use the empirical average of the previous 5 years, and the grower gets to choose which 3 of the previous 5 years are used to determine what the prior to drought provision year average income was.
And it's interesting to note, now that, Ann's, disclosed that we are close to foreseeing that the contract drought emergency provision will get triggered this year. And I just want everyone to know this is a rare circumstance. Though, as she mentioned, the last time it happened was in 2015. And DWR did establish the special claims process, and folks submitted and were reimbursed, compensated, I guess is the correct word, compensated. But it is rare that all 3 of these things get triggered. So it's interesting that our contract's been around since 1981, and yet really this 21st century, and I guess you can say maybe climate change, we are definitely seeing different patterns that are causing it to get triggered.
We put this slide together back after the 2015 process. Just want all of the landowners to know that the information for the claims procedure is pretty extensive. Steve, I know you can tell everybody a lot more information about this, but the DWR really does need some detailed information and documentation to go through that process. The other thing to note is the claims procedure takes time. I think last time it took over a year to process and pay landowners. This year, I do think we have a bit of a head start. We've got 2015 as a starting point, as a basis for that procedure. And also we are coordinating with DWR more closely and ahead of time. And so I think we are more on the front end this year as compared to then, but it is an extended process to go through.
Yeah, I think in 2015, the majority of that it took because they had to establish the claims procedure because they hadn't done one in
Since the 90s.
Yeah, since the 90s,
Yeah.
at least a decade or 2.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So just to wrap up on this, we're continuing to monitor conditions and we'll continue to coordinate with DWR staff and pass information along to landowners through the North Delta board meetings, potentially other drought informational board meetings like this one, and Melinda and Cindy can help disseminate that information.
I think the thing I would add at this point, and because really good job, appreciate it, is as was done in 2015, as we said, the way the contract reads is it's DWR's responsibility to establish the special claims process. As Cindy said, because it was done recently, it's not reinventing the wheel. So that's the good news. But like last time in 2015, because it is their process, not ours, We will probably ask them to do what they did last time, which is DWR hosted a public meeting so that they could be the ones to directly, they could show all of our landowners who are interested possibly in submitting a claim, could ask questions directly to DWR. So we're not a middleman, because we don't want to give any incorrect information. So again, as Ann said, we're in close communication with them. But that would be our request. So it would, when it gets triggered, just stay tuned, because there may be a DWR public meeting to specifically lay out and explain to everyone how the claims process works, and provide, can you turn that off? And provide an opportunity for everyone to ask questions.
All right.
And I guess before we moved on to the 2023, is there questions or comments that people have on what Ann presented in terms of our contract and both your protection from curtailment and the potential for a claims process?
I'm always full of questions, but Ann, you've done a great job and I have none. So I would presume that most of us are happy with your presentation. If anybody has any, please speak up now. Otherwise, we're going to move on.
All right, I'll ask one quick question. And Ben Colbert here. In your list of requirements to prove that you need you asked for insurance, crop insurance. Is that a requirement to have crop insurance?
I think that's a better question for Melinda or Steve, or maybe Kevin.
Eventually, it's really the question, that's the kind of question that will be for DWR when they have a public meeting, because they're the ones that set all of those standards. We don't.
To let you know, Ben, I participated in 2015, and myself and 4 landowners that I leased from were 4 of the 8 claims. And a direct question from them was whether we received a crop insurance payment. And that's all that was. They wanted to make sure that we weren't double dipping. But again, as Melinda said, DWR will answer these questions. I don't think they'll change, but that's what I was asked.
Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that.
That was helpful, Steve. Thanks. All right.
Well, I'm hoping 2023 is very wet and all this goes away, but
Yeah, me too.
go ahead, Melinda.
Yeah, we just thought there's a couple of things, for 2023 that may happen and may not, as Ann said, if we get a good wet year this year. But one of them, as many of you know, this year, DWR was talking about potentially installing temporary drought barriers in the North Delta, 2 of them, one on Steamboat Slough and one on Sutter Slough. The agency engaged extensively with DWR and some of our reclamation districts. We even did some on-site visits to mostly talk to them about where to actually locate those. And the good news is, actually, there's quite a bit of good news. One is they decided not to install the barriers this year. But the other good news is those meetings were fruitful in the sense that they did agree that the locations that our locals were really recommending, and it was really locations to avoid disruption to a lot of the diversions that are on those sloughs, and put them in better locations and yet achieve the water quality benefits that is intended by the installation of these barriers. But even though they decided not to install this year, their planning is ongoing, and they've been doing some modeling during this time period, because they are planning at this point for a potential installation on minor and steamboat sloughs from June 15th through November 15th, 2023. So again, as Ann said, if we're, just even like this year, once they were getting enough precipitation where they thought they could maintain water quality with their releases, they chose not to do it. It's an expensive endeavor, but it's, in an emergency situation where they are concerned about maintaining water quality, it is something they will look at. But, obviously with a June installation, we'll know, well, in this, winter and spring, what kind of year we're having at that point. But as I said, the locations that they came up was kind of near the bottom of Steamboat Slough and near the Arrowhead Marina on Minor Slough. So those were the locations. And as we get closer, to 2023 and potential installation, we can provide maps and some more detailed descriptions, but we're just giving a heads up really at this point. They would be 48-inch diameter culverts. They would have operable gates, and there would be some increased salinity levels in certain locations and potential increased water surface elevations immediately upstream, particularly at the Minor Slough barrier. So again, we're just highlighting that this is a potential thing and that DWR absolutely is continuing with the planning. They are continuing to do the planning under the governor's emergency drought proclamation, which means they do not have to do CEQA. But they will have to go through all the permit processes. They're not exempted from that. Ann, anything, or Gary want to add to that?
I would like to add a thank you to Tom and Justin and his father, Justin Van Lovensel's father, Topper, for taking the time to meet with DWR. And I'd like to point out to people that this is not something that the North Delta Water Agency is in favor of or has pushed, other than the fact that it might help keep the whole Delta fresh. That is the only benefit to us. So those that are downstream from this that are going to be negatively impacted, that again may be where Article 4 comes in 2023. We'll see. But I believe that some people will be hurt because DWR does not have to go through the CEQA process. And if they did, they would have to mitigate negative downstream impacts by providing alternate water sources such as overland or wells. So that's
and thanks, Steve. And DWR's intent is to do agreements with each of the landowners in these areas to provide those mitigations through agreements with individual landowners and reclamation districts as well. That's what they've done when they installed at the False River. So there would be a lot of work, involving the landowners and reclamation districts if those move forward. Let's see. Thank you. So the other potential thing that might happen next year is an extension of a pilot program that was implemented this year where the Department of Water Resources funded incentive payments essentially for landowners to voluntarily do some different cropping actions on their property. And it's a pilot program because at this point, one of the things that's being done is I think there was some 35 grants covering about, I think it's actually more like 8,700 acres all throughout the Delta. A lot of it is in the North Delta, but essentially the different state agencies will do an evaluation of what level of water consumption reduction or water conservation, if you will, occurred from the different types of actions, because each of these grants involves different decisions by the landowner. But they'll be able to kind of measure, if you will, those and determine where do you get the most bang for the buck? What type of activity resulted in the most water conservation? We are hearing though, and so we wanted to let you know that because when we talked to the department about implementing the program this year, one of the things we kept telling them is the earlier you make this decision and create the grant program, the more participants you'll have, because these farmers need to make these decisions about, buying seed and fertilizer and all that very early. So our understanding is DWR has expressed interest in looking at the possibility of doing this program again next year. And they understand the early concepts. So if they do decide to do it, they're thinking about, having the application process be more in the September, October. It would be for the actions you actually do in 2023. But again, it allows earlier decision-making by the farmers. We're really not going to know whether this will be a funded program for 2023 until the state budget is approved, which will be, they have to do that by June 30th. So at least we'll know an answer by the time the state budget is passed on whether DWR in fact got funding to do such a program for next year. But it is a possibility that we want folks to know about and possibly consider. Again, it's completely voluntary, and that's how it would work.
And for those of you who are wondering, this does not free water up for export. The water that is saved, if you will, through this program is for in-Delta environmental purposes.
That's a good point. Thank you, Steve. And with that, we've come to the end and the final opportunity, I guess I would say, for some questions and, just discussion, any comments, and now's the time. Well, Anne, you must have done such a fabulous job that folks don't have a lot of questions. We will, obviously, we can post both the PowerPoint on our website, but as Cindy mentioned at the beginning, we did record this. So if you want to watch it again, you'll be able to do that. And if you want to, tell people that they should go watch it, that would be great as well. But it will be there for that purpose. And, if you do have questions, please feel free to, email our office, Cindy or I, and, we'll try to answer questions the best we can. And as Steve said at the front end of the meeting, this may be, one of more than several, drought briefings that we may need to have. And we'll just have to see. But as I said, probably the next one I would expect is hopefully, one by DWR, if the contract drought provision does get triggered and they are required to then establish the claims process.
And that was my question for Kevin, whether he wants to weigh in now or at a future meeting is up to him. But I was curious about what happens if, it's obvious that two of the provisions of Article 4 are going to happen. Although I guess the 8.5 million acre feet a year, we only need 1 million acre feet. We could get some miracle rainfall event between now and the end of the water year, which is September 30th or last day of September.
Well,
But
actually, could I just stop you right there for a second, Steve? And
Yeah.
I want to clarify something really quick, Steve. And my understanding is in our contract, May 1 is the final water tally for determining this, or is that?
Yeah, so the May 1 Bulletin 120 is what sets the final criteria.
Thank you for that clarification. Thank you. But Kevin, the fact that the TUCP is going to come and go and be gone before the end of the water year, does that have any bearing on the claims process under Article 4?
Well, I think what we're hoping to do, Steve, as you know, is to get DWR to simply agree that the claims process will be in place so that if the TCP goes away, it doesn't remove the applicability of that provision. And based on the discussions we've had, we think that DWR is willing to reach that agreement with us. If they're not, then it could get a little complicated, but I don't think that's going to be the case.
And those are I think that's the type of thing though, that as Ann was saying, we're trying to have continual discussions with DWR and, we'll make sure to have those discussions so that it can be clarified and discussed at the public hearing that they have when they talk about a claims process. So it can be clear to everybody how that will work.
Well, if the real goal of DWR is to reduce consumption in the Delta, there are a lot of people out here right now that are taking out forage crops and are going to plant to silage corn because it's very lucrative. And if they would like to stop that use of water, which is legally available to the growers to grow that silage corn crop, there needs to be some certainty to these growers whether they are going to be compensated for the loss of income that they would have ordinarily received by doing their normal thing.
Well, Steve, again, I'll point out that the contract is very clear that if it's planted to a different crop, it needs to be a more salt tolerant crop. And I'm not a farmer, so I don't know if the crop you talked about, it's worth more money. They don't pay for that. They pay if it's a more salt tolerant crop. So I want to be clear.
I believe the language talks about more drought tolerant also.
I don't think
so.
so.
That may not come into play in the instance that I'm talking about. That would be something more for the pilot program, probably.
That's what I was about to say, that no, our contract is very clear. It's salt tolerant, not drought tolerant. But I was going to bring up what you just said, Steve, which is in addition, though, if they have this other, if they extend the pilot program, it's different because it's not a compensation thing like our contract is. They just pay a per acre thing to do something different, as Steve is saying. So there might be dual opportunities, but I do want to be clear that the contract, if it's a different crop planted to a different crop, it has to be a more salt tolerant crop.
Very well. I thank you all for participating. Are there any questions of Ann or Gary or Kevin or Melinda? Well, hearing none, thank you for our staff for taking the time, Cindy for getting everything together, and all of you for your attendance and participation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.